Timeline of life, the Carboniferous period. The timeline of life, the Carboniferous period. The Carboniferous period is also known as the Age of Amphibians. It occurred about 359 to 299 million years ago. It is actually divided into two smaller parts, the Mississippian and later the Pennsylvanian era. This is what the Earth looked like about 240 million years ago. During the Carboniferous period, Euramerica, which would include North America, Northern Europe, and Greenland, remained separate from Gondwana to the south. Parts of Asia, including China, were surrounded by warm oceans. At the end of the Pennsylvanian period, Africa collided with North America, which would help to form the Appalachian Mountains. By the end of the Pennsylvanian era, the continents were beginning to move towards the supercontinent Pangaea. In the lowlands and in the swamps, there was a huge growth of forests. In the warm and tropical weather in North America and Europe, large ferns such as the Ceronius grew to heights of 23 feet. They looked similar to modern palm trees, and these ferns dispersed spores which fell to the warm, moist earth and grew into breeding plants with male and female cells. Male cells would fertilize the female cells, which would then develop into a normal fern plant. Calamites were actually ancient horsetails that towered to heights of up to 100 feet. They had tall jointed stems and upswept branches with rings of narrow leaves, and they grew in both North America and Europe. Lepidodendron is the best known club moss. It towered up to 150 feet. It had a root-like anchoring organ divided into 4 main branches. It also had a tall bare trunk within sets of forked branches and narrow leaves, and small and large spores in cones. This is a fossil of a cycad. A cycad is a plant with a thick unbranched trunk and long fern-like leaves. Cycads survived, though the tree ferns died out. Sigillaria, another tree, was actually a 50-foot high club moss growing in the Carboniferous swamps. As they died, the layers of branches and leaves from ferns and club mosses like Sigillaria built up, and in time the accumulation became pressed together and would form coal. It took millions of years to form all of our coal deposits and iron deposits. In fact, we still use the coal today for sources of energy. Another important contribution of the Carboniferous forests is what happened with both the carbon dioxide and oxygen levels during this time. The growth of these forests removed a lot of this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and greatly increased our levels of oxygen. In fact, the oxygen levels during the Carboniferous period was about 30%, as compared to about 20% today. The great increase in oxygen levels allowed for a huge increase in the insect population, and the insects grew to giant sizes. There were deadly, poisonous centipedes that grew to 6 feet in length. There were mammoth cockroaches and scorpions that would often grow to sizes of 3 feet in length. There were giant dragonflies that would often become the size of seagulls. Their wingspans could be measured at least of 2.5 feet. The Carboniferous period, the Age of Amphibians. This was because it was the development of amphibians on Earth. Amphibians, due to the plant material, the larger insects as a food source, as well as the increase in oxygen, were able to grow in size and diversity. There were some species that looked more like crocodiles with very sharp teeth and would grow even as long as 20 feet long. Eventually, towards the end of the Pennsylvanian era, they developed thicker, scaly skin that allowed them to survive outside of the water without their skin drying out. Eventually, this would develop into our early reptiles. The Permian period began at the end of the Carboniferous period. It only lasted a relatively short amount of time, about 47 million years ago. As the early amphibians began to develop the ability to come on land and develop the thicker, tighter fitting scales, we began to see the first herbivorous reptiles. For example, the plesiosaur, which is a basin-shaped lizard, they were mammal-like reptiles that first sprawled onto land. They evolved into a species that stood erect, had more body hair, and had several kinds of teeth and were warm-blooded. In North America and Europe, these precursors to the dinosaurs dominated life on land. Another type example of an early reptile was the Ophiocodon. It was a 12-foot lizard-like body with an alligator-type head and jaws with many sharp teeth. There were great deposits of salt being formed as the trapped seas began to dry up and the first deserts and red sands appeared on Earth. Some of the early amphibians began to decline, and as they were more predators on Earth, insects began to make a great metamorphosis. Instead of being the large giant insects that proliferated the Carboniferous period, they began to become much smaller creatures on Earth. All of this is in preparation for what is to come next, the age of the dinosaurs.